So it is news to none of you that there is no time during the liturgical year when Jews gather in such numbers and with such enthusiasm as at our high holiday season, making an appropriate season for us to talk about the manner in which we gather, to what end, and in what mindset. To that end, I'd like to share with you a few thoughts on this first day of the year 5784. The evening started innocuously enough. We were sharing dinner in our sukkah with our neighbors whose son attended the same elementary school as our two boys. We talked about their teachers, about the classroom dynamics, and then the conversation meandered over to the topic of the school's new grading scheme. Either my husband Daniel or myself expressed our frustration at the revised reporting cards that we felt revealed very little about our kids' actual performance. And our neighbors chimed in defense of the new system, in the process airing differences with a number of the established policies with which my husband and I were quite comfortable. We listened politely and then contributed our own contrasting views. And so it went. We found ourselves drawn into a lively repartee about education policy, which I sensed was beginning to generate as much heat as light. Just as I was about to intervene to suggest that we shift our focus to a different topic, one of our guests piped up saying that it was a school night and they needed to be heading home. Later that evening, as Daniel and I were carrying the last of the dishes from the sukkah into the house, he turned to me and asked the question that we had both been mulling over silently. Do you think they left because it was late or because of the conversation? I didn't dare answer, but inwardly I prayed that we had not brought to a premature close one of the most important friendships that we had established since moving to our home in Ithaca. For several days thereafter, I looked expectantly towards our neighbor's house, hoping to catch them when they were out playing in the yard or running an errand, just to clear the air. But the opportunity never seemed to present. A week went by, maybe a week and a half, and finally I saw my neighbors rolling their trash can out to the curb. Affecting the most nonchalant stride that I could muster, I grabbed my own trash can and headed out to meet them. As I opened my mouth, prepared to apologize for any offense I may have caused over dinner, my neighbor gave me a beleaguered smile and said, "Has your week been as crazy as ours? I feel like we haven't had a free moment since that lovely dinner that we shared in your sukkah." I felt as if my knees would buckle with relief. Thinking back on that incident sometime later, I wondered if I'd been a bit paranoid. After all, who would end a friendship over a difference of opinion about school policy? But as I myself have experienced, and I'm guessing more than a handful of you as well, there are actually a large and growing number of people who would cancel or ghost or silence or otherwise truncate a relationship with people with whom they'd been friendly, sometimes for years, over a seemingly minor difference of opinion. We are becoming a society that is simultaneously exceptionally polarized and extremely conflict averse, a bizarre and completely dysfunctional pairing of traits. We're polarized in part because attitudes about subjects as diverse as politics, pronouns, or even brands of beer can become absolutely definitional in terms of the way that we see ourselves and others. And we're conflict averse in that we live in constant dread of making statements or hearing statements with which we or those with whom we're in conversation do not agree. or of saying something that our friends, our classmates, our work colleagues, or fellow congregants might take offense at. So where does that leave us? We find ourselves increasingly confined to ghettoized conceptual spaces in which we surround ourselves with people with whom we hope we're in complete agreement on a whole laundry list of topics. And even in these spaces, even in these selected spaces, and almost always when we venture out of them, we constrain our interactions to completely innocuous subjects like stupid cat videos. Now, really, how much real community can you build over films of cats chasing fluff? It's for this reason that Judaism is and has historically been absolutely allergic to the type of self-silencing and siloization that is taking place contemporarily. Jewish culture is and has long been a proponent of robust dialogue between individuals holding different views. Nowhere is this better exemplified than in the Talmud, arguably Judaism's most central text, in which the most revered sages are referenced in relationship to their bar plukta, the contemporary with whom they engage in regular and heated debate. The best known example of this, of course, is the pairing of Hillel and Shammai, or more accurately, Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, because the debates between their camps went on for generations. It wasn't just the foundational sages, but also their students whose views were at odds with one another and who nevertheless continued to argue and debate. Indeed, they even, we are told, married their children one to another. Of course, a culture dedicated to robust debate needs to learn some principles that allow these discussions to transpire in a manner that is edifying and unifying, that brings people together and allows their different perspectives to contribute to a strengthening of a common goal to which all parties are expected to subscribe. I believe that it's important for us, indeed vital, in a world in which so many debates have ceased to be unifying or even to transpire, that we remind ourselves of some of the ground rules of constructive discussion which our culture has been formulating across the centuries. And so here are a few of the principles that I've gleaned from rabbinic precedent. The first is the principle of a machloket l'shem shamayim, an argument engaged in for the service of a greater good. There was an interesting story shared in the Washington Post some months ago concerning the backroom deliberations that were going on around the budgetary impasse at the federal level. The politicians interviewed, who held influential positions in their own parties, were asked what it was like to sit for hours in a room with other politicians well known for publicly and vociferously belittling the speaker, as well as the positions that they espoused. Well, actually, one of the interviewees replied, when we're in a room together, out of view of the media, away from microphones and cameras, my colleague is quite reasonable and congenial. We can have substantive discussions of our differences. But once we step out of that room and the cameras and the microphones appear, well, then he's a different person altogether. Although the case of these national politicians is an extreme one, most of us, if we're honest with ourselves, participate in public or at least potentially publicized discussions with at least two audiences in mind. The first of these audiences is, of course, the person who's standing in front of us, the person that we're addressing as an individual or as a stand-in for a certain point of view. But the second audience to our discussion, unseen except in our mind's eye, is that gallery of individuals whom we seek to impress by demonstrating our rhetorical skills or our devotion to a particular cause or set of values. And it's the comments that we address to this second audience that are likely to get us into the most trouble. When we speak to establish and bolster our own position, rather than to learn from or engage with the ideas of others, we assume a posture of intransigence, intolerance, and often feigned self-confidence. We become caricatures of ourselves, and at the same time fall into a pattern of rehashing arguments that almost always fail to convince anyone, even ourselves. In their commentaries, the early sages made a distinction between the self-serving attacks of Korach on Moshe and the high-minded disputes that occurred between Hillel and Shammai. They described the first set of disputes, those launched by Korach and his followers, as self-aggrandizement, and they condemned them. But the debates that were stirred up with the goal of gaining greater insight into an issue and arriving at better solutions, these they labeled machlokot l'shem shamayim, disputes for the sake of heaven, and held to be amongst the purest and most noble of human pursuits. The second principle that our rabbis established to teach us is kavod habriut, a basic respect for one's fellow human beings. In educational circles, teachers are counseled to think in terms of bad behaviors rather than bad children. And it's a lesson that has traction far beyond the classroom. Our politicians, social media outlets, and in some cases, unfortunately, religious institutions have conditioned us to think about people who view certain issues differently from our own as bad or evil. That mindset is in itself a bad or unproductive way of thinking. Let's be clear. Two individuals who hold equally lofty intentions, a similar level of vestedness in an issue, and a comparable degree of concern for the greater good can nevertheless come to strikingly different conclusions as to what the greater good consists in and what the right answer is to a given question or policy debate. Their differences don't brand either party as bad or wrong in a moral sense. Rather, they highlight the complexity of the issue at hand and the many lenses through which it can be viewed. Respectful debate does not require that you embrace your opponent's worldview. I'll talk more about that in a moment. But it does mean that we keep the discussion focused squarely on the issues, on the ideas, and avoid descending into name-calling and innuendos. Indeed, in Jewish terms, respectful debate demands that we engage with our bar plukta, with a person with whom we're in a conflictual discussion, with an attitude of ledun l'chaf zechu, the highest degree of merit. That is to say, as we look at our opponent in the discussion, we need to attribute to them the most noble motives for holding the views that they do, even when there's that small, or sometimes not so small voice in your head that keeps whispering, but she doesn't really mean it. She's just saying that to catch me out, or in order to win the argument. Acting on the principle of ledun l'chaf zachut means forcing yourself to engage with the ideas that your opponent is putting forth, and to do so on their own merit, whatever your cynical suspicions. It means starting from the assumption that, like you, Your interlocutor seeks to make the world a better place as they understand it. And I want to point out that even if you're wrong in being quite so charitable, your attitude of respectful engagement with the other promotes a culture of frank, fruitful communication, and it keeps the focus of the conversation above board. I would also point out that debates about substantive differences are seldom one-off discussions. So it makes sense to lay the foundation for a subsequent series of equally productive sequels and prequels and rewinds. The third principle that I'd like to talk about today is Shema, listen. Judaism's most revered spiritual directive instructs us to listen rather than speak. Talking comes later. You cannot be an effective conversation partner unless you come to the table ready to hear what others are saying. Too often in conversations in which there is a difference of view being aired, we spend the time that we're not speaking thinking of what we should be saying next, rather than listening to and actually engaging with what the other person is saying to us. But think about how you react when you think that the person that you're addressing isn't hearing you. You fall back to repeating the same point over and over, only louder and more forcibly, and you get annoyed. Not surprisingly, that pattern of interaction doesn't create a whole lot of space for the conversation to advance. It's noteworthy that one of the key conventions of rabbinic debate, as modeled in the Talmud, is that when one party finishes speaking, their conversation partner begins their rebuttal by quoting back a word or phrase from what was just said, and then using that quote as the basis for their own remarks. In this way, the second speaker both acknowledges the first speaker's contribution and focuses the discussion on the specific area in which their views differ. In the process, conveying the understanding that there is a range of topics on which their thoughts concur. And the fourth rabbinic principle on which I want to speak is called teku. There's this great expression that appears numerous times in the Talmud. I actually looked it up, and Rabbi Aaron Pessin claims that it occurs on 317 instances. You can try looking them up yourself. Teku signals a situation in which a discussion has reached an impasse. Both sides have put forth their best arguments as to why a question should be resolved in one manner versus the other, and neither side has prevailed, not upon their bar plukta, not upon their debate partner, nor upon that kind of assumed Greek chorus of rabbinic scholars who populated the Babylonian academies. So the Stama, the anonymous narrator of the Talmud, declares teku, which is an acronym for Tishbi itaretz kushiot uvayot. Eliyahu HaTishbi will come, and at that time, all questions and disputes will be resolved. In other words, we've taken this discussion about as far as we can at this time. We need to move on, or at least to accept our differences. The point of a discussion is not always to arrive at agreed upon point of view. It can't be, because there are issues on which the starting point of the two discussants are just too disparate. The lenses through which they view the issues are too diverse, and their stake in the matter is inherently at odds one with the other. In such situations, the best one can possibly hope for is a respectful and substantive exchange of views. And that's not nothing. The fact that individuals of diametrically different views can be brought together to speak with one another, that they show a willingness to hear views with which they don't agree, and attempt to explain their own ideas to listeners who they don't expect are going to agree with them or even show sympathy. All of these demonstrate a tremendous investment in a larger project of relationship building, and they contribute to a longer-term process of change. Rabbi Avraham Yitzchak HaKohen Kook, the first chief rabbi of pre-state Palestine, was a traditionally devout individual, a chassid. But he piously maintained an ongoing dialogue with secular Jews who shared his passion for creating a Jewish state. In expressing his willingness to cross tribal lines to advance the Zionist project, Harav Kook made a startling to Dr. Alana Steinhain of the Shalom Hartman Institute, who was the keynote speaker at this year's Shoshana Cardin Leadership Symposium. So also thanks to Cindy Goldstein, wherever Cindy is, for her role in bringing Alana to our community. What Harav Kook said was that there were three forces now wrestling within the Jewish people. Holiness, by which he was referring to religious Zionism; nationalism, a reference to secular Zionism; and humanity, a nod of the hat to socialists who also played a central role in Israel's formation. The synthesis of these three great demands, Rav Kook said, is necessary for any one of them to achieve a future. However, in this time, 100 years ago, each of these movements is divided from the others by the oppositional light in which it sees its fellows. For the health of the greater whole, all three elements are necessary. So we must strive to bring each group to affirmatively embrace the other, to appreciate even the oppositional voice and the ideas that it poses in contrast to our own. For it is only through the influence of each group acting in opposition to the other that we will all be saved from the dangers of fundamentalism and extremism. A kind of scary quote to be hearing echoed in our own time. So just to summarize, Rav Kook believed that just by hearing ideas that conflict with our own, just by being in dialogue with other people with different ideas, that each of the dissenting parties would be moved to see their own position somewhat differently. They would be less inclined to prosecute their own position to its logical extreme and would instead, through their own internal processes and of their own volition, adopt a more moderate position. Now, I know that there are those who in our time look at events on the world stage, on the domestic, even local stage, or in Israel, and wonder if Harav Kook got it right. Does being brought into proximity with somebody who radically differs from you in their beliefs and opinions, in their allegiances, and quite likely their personal characteristics, inherently cause you to moderate your views? Well, it probably doesn't do so if the encounter takes the form of some of our made-for-primetime shouting matches that have become the mainstay of national politics and even campus debates. But they might have a more salutary impact if they were staged more discreetly amongst individuals with lower profiles, less interested in posturing and more interested in problem solving. If they were to occur in fora that bound participants to the principles that were exemplified by our sages. I would like to believe that this is the case, or at least that it might be. And that's why I've been working with members of Beth Israel's programming committee to develop a series of programs this year aimed at building our community's adeptness at engaging in difficult conversations. I'm interested in developing within our membership a skill set that will allow us as a community to open the thorny discussions that every Jewish community should be engaging in this era in which the parameters of Jewish identity are themselves in flux, and in which the continuity of every Jewish organization is an open question. And I'm also keen to see members of this community going out as ambassadors and facilitators, carrying this skill set into other forums, both in the Jewish world and in our larger secular society, in order to help deeply polarized factions gain traction in speaking to one another in a meaningful and respectful fashion, with the goal of building mutual understanding, though not always a shared point of view. I'm guessing that if I were to invite our neighbors from Ithaca to come visit us in our sukkah this year, and if our discussion turned once again to education policy, we would still find ourselves on opposing sides of the issue. But this time, having weathered one round of dialogue, neither of us would leave the conversation fearing that our very friendship was endangered by engaging in such a conversation. In fact, by revisiting these questions without our guard up, we might even emerge from our discussion with a bit more understanding, both of the issues being discussed and of one another. Teku. Perhaps that was the end goal that Eliyahu was meant to bring about. We're going to return now to the Machzor in order to complete the end of our Torah service and transition into the Musaf service. As we do so, I know